This video is indeed rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. With the release of patch 7.3, the story and lore of Alexandria has finally come to a head. Many reveals have been made, mysteries have been set, and our cast of characters have shared a variety of moments. But what exactly happened, and how much of this have we seen before? Could we have predicted this outcome with a better understanding of the lore? Perhaps, perhaps not. But the only way to know for sure is to reflect. So, join me as we cover the main story quest of patch 7.3 and the many details that can be found within. Our story begins on a somber note as the Warrior of Light works alongside members of a resistance cell known as Oblivion to gauge the state of Solution 9. Ever since the dismantling of living memory and upheaval of the perfect peace they once knew, the citizens of Solution 9 have become melancholy to say the least. Gone were the days that they could just ignore the harsh and brutal truths of reality. Death was not something that they had overcome. In fact, it had never left. They had simply chosen to forget about it. And without the emotional maturity to bear the weight of this knowledge, many citizens were being crushed under the pressure of fear and anxiety. We have to understand that the people living under the Levin Dome have been fed an artificial life for decades, if not their entire lives. They had little to no reason to think or feel beyond what was presented in front of them. And now that they have to think for themselves beyond the promises of eternity, many didn't know what to do with themselves. But the worst part came from inside their own territory, as some of the security drones made to protect Alexandria had recently gone rogue, suddenly and violently attacking those nearby, instilling an even greater fear of death to those who hear the news. Not only was eternal life a lie, but now their own defenses were slowly turning on them again, much like how Eorzea betrayed them when he was their king. It's no surprise many Alexandrians were either becoming paranoid or completely manic. But our heroes now knew that Calyx, an endless modeled from the memories of a long-dead scientist, was responsible for all of this cruelty. Calyx was not only the mastermind behind the group known as Preservation, but had been subtly pulling the strings of Alexandria and living memory for centuries. His goals were focused purely on his projects to attain what he saw as the peak of evolution. He cares little for the lives he ruins or the world he threatens. Only his goals matter to him. Calyx believes that the cycle of life and death is meaningless, and to exist beyond that cycle is the only thing that they should aspire to. But in his attempt to overcome the forces of nature, he had made a mockery of life by using people like guinea pigs for his experiments and by murdering those he saw as stepping stones toward his ultimate goals. Even the magical crystal he refers to as the key is but an efficient means to that end, which is why he's dedicating so much time and resources to try and get it back from the Warrior of Light, who is now actively challenging them. The recent deaths at the hands of these security units was simply his most recent exploit. Sure, he could have attempted to be more quiet and subtle about these things, but Calyx didn't want to just hurt anyone. He wanted to harm people that the Warrior of Light would learn about almost immediately. A sort of warning that so long as they kept the key from him, more people would continue to perish. But the Warrior of Light began to notice a trend amongst the victims of these rogue drones. They seemed to mostly be targeting people that refused to wear regulators. At first, this makes one believe that Calyx is simply trying to goad people into wearing regulators and embracing his system out of fear. But, as they discovered, it was more than that. Calix wasn't simply targeting those without regulators, he was using his siphoning technology to completely drain all forms of ether from his victims, including material ether. Originally, these devices were used to only remove the ether making up the person's soul and memories, much like how we saw during the invasion of Tuliolol. But now he was taking away everything, leaving nothing but a sand like white ash behind. Those who recall the dungeon known as the Burn are aware that this is what happens when all etheric energy is drained from something. Ether is not only an energy, but is a force of nature responsible for creating most forms of matter and life. So when you remove that energy completely, you're left with this ivory dust that serves essentially no purpose. The members of Oblivion were attempting to prevent these drones from hurting and harvesting ether from any more people when one of their own became yet another victim of Calix. Geode gave his life in his attempt to stop this madness, but instead of trying to run away with his ill-gotten prize, Calix used his drones to hand over the container holding Geode's soul, which he saw as a meager consolation when compared to his grand designs. Geode may be gone, but at least his essence would be safe, leaving the members of Oblivion to decide where and when they should release his spirit later on. Because as long as he is in this container, he is essentially trapped and will never reincarnate. While the Scions and Warrior of Light haven't spent nearly enough time around the members of Oblivion to form meaningful attachments yet, they understand all too well how much it hurts to lose someone you care about. So they give members like Shale and Nostalgia all the time they need to work through the grief of losing an old friend. But Shale uses this loss as a fuel for her resolve, and she redoubles her efforts to find and punish Calix for his atrocities. Not only for how heartlessly he treats the people of Alexandria, but now to avenge Geode as well. As if to taunt them, Calix began broadcasting around Solution 9 to drive greater degrees of civil unrest. Speeches on death and the futility of life spread through the televisions and speakers of Alexandria, creating a singular condition for the people: dread. However, our heroes were not distracted by these attempts at psychological warfare, as they continued to discuss their next plan. But thanks to a more thorough investigation, Shale and other agents were able to uncover a hidden laboratory within Everkeep's 10th level, something that they were certain once belonged to the Preservation Initiative, which, of course, could be a possible lead to discovering where Calix was hiding his core systems. As an Endless created solely from etheric memory, Calix was now more of a program than a living thing. As such, tracking him down was proving to be extremely difficult, since he wouldn't need things like sleep, food, or comforts to work efficiently. But if this lab still held its secrets from the days of Preservation's research, then perhaps it might have something that'll point them in Calix's direction. So our heroes venture forth once again into the bowels of Everkeep, arriving at level 10 and discovering an entirely abandoned lab. Everyone was shocked to discover how little had changed in this place since it was last used, but they eventually learned why. Not only was a variety of sensitive research done here, but the lab had entered a sort of lockdown protocol. The researchers wished that their stations would not be tampered with, or at least not until the right time. And we even learned how far they were willing to go to cover up their own secrets, executing their own co-workers in cold blood if they didn't follow the visions of Calix to the letter. This extreme method of record keeping goes to show why knowledge of Calix and Preservation had gone unknown, or at least obscure, for so long. And as they would discover, Research performed here included, but was not limited to, the electrope device holding the key, soul siphoning technology, regulator development, and greater research into creating Endless. While many researchers of preservation likely saw their work here as something to be celebrated, our heroes and even some ex-researchers proved that Calyx's vision was never to uplift Alexandrians, but to undermine the natural order itself by abusing the life-giving properties of ether. And if Calyx got his hands on the key, he would bring tremendous harm not only to the source, but to all the reflections, including the people we know upon the first. Allowing Calyx to have the key was never an option. But their investigation bore fruit, soon discovering a hidden chamber and a computer with its own network. Shale took advantage of this and began going through its data since she had the most experience with this hardware. It's important to note that she even discovered the traces of code she was looking for and had already begun tracing it back to Calyx's position. But she also discovered that Calyx had not only been watching the Warrior of Light since they took the key, but that he was watching them right now. Having been discovered, Calyx took control of the monitors, choosing to address the party directly instead of letting them discover his location on their own. Uklamat even took this opportunity to ask Calyx why he allowed the Endless Fiend to go so far if it meant losing the key to the Warrior of Light. To which he sighs and admits that this was never part of his plan. While the Endless Fiend was just an etheric copy of the original person, she had enough independence to tell that something wasn't right. She understood that someone she couldn't see was trying to pull her strings. And during her final fight with the Warrior of Light, she gained so much power and control over the systems of Alexandria that even Calyx, for once, was entirely locked out. He could not stop her, even though he wanted to. So, even in defeat, the Endless Fiend made sure that the key would end up in the hands of someone more worthy. Even without knowing whom she was spiting, the Endless Fiend made sure that Calyx would not have his way so easily. But to that end, Calyx offered up his location freely, the Mezzo Terminal, tempting the Warrior of Light and their allies to come after him soon, or he would continue to slay and harvest more Alexandrians. But why would he give up his location so easily? Simple, because Shale had already discovered how to track him right before he interrupted. She was going to discover his hiding spot regardless, and likely would have been able to warn the Warrior of Light if he was lying. But by telling the truth and giving them an ultimatum, Calyx made sure to instill a sense of urgency into the party. They knew his threat to harm more innocent people wasn't a lie, and that his violence might only escalate the longer they keep him waiting. If the Warrior of Light was provoked into coming after him immediately, then they'd have less time to prepare, giving Calyx a tremendous home field advantage. However, if Calyx had allowed time to pass, it's very likely that our heroes would have begun to notice things. Familiar things. And if they discovered what he was planning, he would lose what he saw as his greatest trump card in this confrontation. Nevertheless, our heroes took Calyx at his word and were ready to set out for the Mezzo Terminal. But before they left, they felt it important to inform those who needed to know of the soon-to-be conflict. Much to their surprise, many citizens that they've met and been helping this entire time made their presence known. They wanted our heroes to know that Oblivion didn't have to look after Solution 9 alone anymore. With these civilians now acting as free agents, the amount of people ensuring Calyx couldn't simply do as he pleased anymore had multiplied. And with a twist of humor, they confessed that Smeen had not exactly been the most discreet with her presence. But instead of being rejected, like she had feared, Sphene discovered that the citizenry were happy to see her. While they knew that the Endless Sphene and her weren't the same person, they both shared the same love for Alexandria and its people, and that is what the people chose to believe in. So with hearts full, our heroes strode to the Mesoterminal, determined to finally put an end to Calix and his plans. Unsurprisingly, his invitation was a dangerous one, as the Mesoterminal itself sought to slow their advance. It's extremely likely that Calix knew that this place wouldn't defeat them, but defeating the Warrior of Light was never the goal with these paltry tricks. No, Calix was continuing to gather data and hopefully tire our heroes out so that their final confrontation would be even more favorable to him. But what shocked the party most was the realization that many of the Endless Calix was using had come from the times of the Storm Surge. This meant that Calix had been experimenting on Alexandrians and turning them into Endless long before it was considered necessary. This revelation disgusts Sphene, who now renounces Calix and all the twisted plans he had created in the name of preservation. After defeating the dungeon, Calix reveals himself and acknowledges that the terminal holding his memories is standing before our party, which of course was guarded, as he'd be a fool not to defend himself. However, he also explains that this is the only copy of his etheric memories, as preservation had set ground rules against reckless memory duplication. This was likely to prevent multiple copies of a single Endless from fighting one another, as all of them would eventually claim to be the real person, when in reality they're all copies of the same individual. Even Calix, as he stood over you, technically isn't the original Calix. In fact, we've no idea what happened to his soul and body after his memories were converted into being an Endless. However, before our heroes can probe him for more information, he wastes no time in placing his most powerful piece upon the board. Calix begins to summon a primal. But not just any primal, one that he states a concept was used to bring into being. That word should immediately serve as a red flag, as concepts were only known to be used by the ancients, meaning that the knowledge Calix possesses had to come from only one group of people, the Ascians. But no time can be spent pondering this, as the primal of death, Necron, is summoned within the Mesoterminal. All along, the black regulators that Calix had created for the citizens of Alexandria were meant to turn their wearers into willing thralls for the summoning, as the creation of a primal requires only two things: tremendous amounts of ether and belief. Living Memory already had a surplus of lightning ether, meaning that belief was all that was missing. Having been modeled with a concept, provided an abundance of ether and 5,000 willing thralls, Necron proves to be an exceptionally well-made and efficient primal. Certainly more dangerous than anything a beast tribe could be able to conjure. Not only that, but Calix seemingly has complete control over it. By providing warding scales, the Scions ensure that nobody present is tempered by Necron, and their battle begins. But no matter how well made Necron is, the Warrior of Light is a notorious primal slayer, and eventually deals a decisive blow. However, Calix still has an abundance of ether and belief, making the resummoning of Necron rather child's play. Anyone who understands how primal summoning works would know that this was now a battle of attrition, something that Calix no doubt had planned for. However, Sphene gets an idea, asking the members of Oblivion to broadcast her voice throughout the entirety of Solution 9. With a heartfelt plea, she urges the people not to fall so easily to despair. And with a rousing speech, she not only turns much of Solution 9 with her words, but even the Tempered seem to waver ever so slightly. This dramatic emotional shift coming from Solution 9 begins to interfere with the faith Necron needs to be resummoned. It's important to remember that this isn't the first time we've seen a primal waver from a lack of unified vision. Yatsuyu's own transformation into Tsukuyomi was disrupted by her own lack of hatred for a short time, which is why she created phantoms of people she despised in hopes of redoubling her zeal and filling her heart with malice. However, in Necron's case, the tempered Alexandrians are still in play. So, while Sphne's speech may not have stopped the summoning, it did debuff Necron long enough for our party to challenge it again. Calix saw the writing on the wall, realizing that if the Primal Slayer continued to turn the odds in their favor by defeating their creation over and over again, defeat would be all but certain. Thus, Calix decides to transfer his etheric memories to a new hub in order to save his fragile existence. With the Warrior of Light and Scions keeping Necron busy, Wuk-Lamat is charged with breaking down the barrier to the device holding Calix together. However, the barrier does prove to be rather durable, requiring the aid of Sphene to completely destroy. With the barrier gone, the party was able to defeat the resummoned Necron just in time to attack the hub. The Warrior of Light wastes little time in delivering a decisive blow to the system, attempting to destroy it and Calix along with it. To which they succeed. The terminal erupts into a flurry of destructive pulses, leaving nothing behind but smoldering scrap. As far as they know, Calix is gone. With victory secured, the party leaves the Mesoterminal with exhausted Scions and a severely wounded Wuk-Lamat, as it would appear that striking the barrier over and over had harmed her quite substantially. But with Calix gone and the Primal slain, everyone was confident that those living under the Levin Dome would be able to finally move on. Wuk-Lamat was sent back to Tuliolal to recover. Grahatia and Kryl created a comprehensive report for Old Charlian to document and store. Meanwhile, Scions like Alize helped to teach the Alexandrians how to not only undo the tempering of those 5,000 who wore the Black Regulators, but how this technique could also serve in aiding their Levin sickness as well. Galul-Ja, recognizing that the king's authority means little when you cannot defend yourself, decides to travel to Tural and train under the Landsguard. That way he might one day mature into a worthy king that can defend his people with more than words. As for the Warrior of Light, they assist the others in a new project that will help restore the missing memories of those who had been wearing the regulators their whole life. Just as it was explained in Endwalker, memories aren't easily ripped from a living person's body. It's far easier to smother and cover them up, and this was the same case for Alexandria. If the terminals in living memory were activated properly, all of the people's missing memories would be restored to them. However, even if living memory was reactivated, the endless stored here wouldn't return, as the ether and systems that had been storing these memories had already failed. But even if the memories stored here were gone, the spirits of those trapped within living memory had been set free. And that is what truly matters. So with living memory reactivated alongside a new command, all of their memories were restored. Memories of loss and pain, but also joy and comfort. Because even if we grieve those that pass on, it means that we loved them. And that love is a warmth that can be carried into the future. With their memories restored, the systems of creating Endless dismantled, and Calix defeated, Alexandria finally had a chance to start over. But that's not all. Calix had successfully transferred his etheric memories to a new hub. Where? It's impossible to say for now, but even after the successful transfer, He was haunted by visions and feelings he had long forgotten. The fear of death that he thought he had outgrown had not only returned, it had a face, and would cause even his fabricated existence to shudder in absolute terror. Raging at his failure, he addresses a person in familiar robes as they appear. The word concept earlier indeed had meaning, as an Ascian wordlessly approaches Calyx from the shadows. This shouldn't be surprising, as there are 4 Ascians whose fates have been unknown since the final days. However, they seem to be calling themselves the Winterers now, and their ultimate goal seems to be a complete mystery, one that we will discuss in another video. But now, I hope this summarization of the 7.3 story pleases you. If you found this video helpful in clearing up some details involving the MSQ, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more lore content in the future. I myself have plenty of videos to create now with the story of Dawntrail ended, so look forward to seeing those soon. But until that day comes, as always, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. But before I go, I'd like to acknowledge my biggest contributors. A grand thank you to Amina Viltaria, Nare, and Potato. Links to things like my channel Discord, social media, and connections to my channel artist Caddy can be found down in the description below. Thank you all once again for your viewership, and I hope you have a wonderful day.